Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, well, welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Jason Brown. I'm a cloud solutions architect with Right Brain Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me is software and data consultant Tom Kowalski.
Hello.
And also joining us today is our subject matter expert is Preston Frazier, senior software engineer from the Interoperability Institute. Welcome, everyone.
Good to be here.
Awesome. All right. So in this episode, we're going to discuss serverless security, which is a very broad topic. So I imagine we'll probably want to even split this up into multiple discussions depending on what we end up digging into. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So I'd like to kick things off by just talking about some of the more common security risks in serverless environments and serverless architecture. So yeah, I guess I'll toss a question over to you, Tom. In the context of serverless architecture, how can insecure configurations lead to security vulnerabilities? And like, what are some general best practices to help mitigate the risks?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? When you just in general, just thinking about serverless security, and the idea of serverless is there's less that you have to worry about in terms of security, right? AWS has more of that shared responsibility on their side and making sure things are patched and before we jump into your question, right? Just a little tidbit on it, move some of our stuff over to serverless and running an AWS Lambda. And when the it's like Heartbleed virus is get the exact name, it was like 2 of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
When that came out, it was we had to patch some of our stuff that wasn't serverless, but it was nice that we had a team of hundreds of engineers, AWS solving those problems for us, right? Like while I was sleeping. So, just, not going to necessarily what, serverless that you have to be aware of now in terms of security, but the nice, what is abstracted away, right, from AWS is another interesting topic that jumps to my mind that, I wanted to get out and talking about. What was the question that you had for originally?
Yeah, no worries. I mean, you basically partially answered it, but I want to talk a little bit about how like insecure configuration of the serverless resources in your environment could lead to some security vulnerabilities. I mean, you had mentioned just a minute ago that like when things like EC2 instances, right, with AMIs that some of which are generated by AWS, they will update these and patch them so that your instances can spin up. But that for something that's more serverless, like you don't have to worry about that as much, right? Because you're not working with, let's say if you're using Lambda, you're not worrying about things quite at like the OS level or securing your server. It's more about securing your functions, right? Like,
Yeah.
I just kind of want to go into that and talk about like what are the differences there.
Yeah, so that there are some things that change, right? And you have to focus on when it becomes serverless. And usually when you're dealing with serverless, it's all infrastructure as code. You can't get around it, right? You have to define, how it's deployed. I guess you can manually do some things, but like you're saying, the configuration plays a big role in what you have set there. So, and then there's different tools that you can't use out of the box, right? With other serverless security suites that can kind of, be an agent and looking, in real time. You kind of have to do it more at that level of how is my application defined, right? With the security. And there are other security tools out there that will look at, the configuration, making sure you have the least privilege, all things that you should have with, normal legacy infrastructure. But yeah, it is a little different when working with serverless, because yeah, you do have to look at that config more than the just kind of like, having an agent passive looking at it. Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, to just add on to that, I think a lot of the stuff, like Tom said, is going to be configuration that's deployed. And, with serverless and other services in the cloud that aren't, quote, serverless, because there's a lot of services that basically run on traditional legacy architecture. It's just kind of an abstracted layer. With that, cloud providers like AWS really keep you in the guide rails on like OS level security tools. You get a lot of, ability to manage your network yourselves. There's a lot of network, there's a lot of network layer things that you can do to really restrict the services in your cloud. Your virtual private cloud is something that, a lot of your services will probably live in. So a lot of the guide rails are there for you. Again, like Tom said, these cloud providers are working day and night to find the newest vulnerabilities and patch those. So the next time your serverless, architecture system is triggered or hit, those changes are already deployed and your architecture just uses those. So at like a infrastructure level, a lot of that's taken care of. Application side, there's still a lot of the traditional application security that you still need to consider.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And we talked a little bit, I think, Tom, you'd mentioned the principle of least privilege, which is just a general principle that can be applied regardless of whether it's like a more traditional architecture or serverless. But, it's, could we, I'd like to dive into that a little bit more, just kind of to give a brief explanation of what that means and how it looks a little bit differently for something serverless rather than like having servers, right? Because like, if I've got a function, I'm not whitelisting, IPs, that this, server can reach out to, or that, for IPs that can access the server, right? So, things, it looks a little bit different when you
Yeah, it does look a little different. Like the idea of traditional infrastructure, kind of like your least privilege, you're kind of narrowing ports and, different routes and things like that, configuring firewalls. But in the serverless sense, it's, it's really, if we're talking about AWS, it really comes down to the permissions, right? IAM, the roles, policies, and what they can interact with. What's nice about it is it allows you to get really fine grained. If you're using Dynamo, for instance, you can get right down to the different tables and what they can do and access on those various tables, so that if it does become compromised, your application, it's limited to what that compromised application can access and the information, you're limiting that blast radius, if you will.
I agree with that. But I'd also like to say that with some of the serverless architecture, you can apply, I guess in the AWS world, you can apply something like a security group to your serverless resources, like Lambda, for example. And those security groups are more on the network level, and you even can control what IP and port inbound traffic and outbound traffic can access your containers there. And that's something that we actually use often when we're connecting serverless architecture to more traditional servers. Say, for example, in AWS, like an EC2 server, or a database, we can give the Lambda specific network permissions to connect to those services. So it does kind of corral them a little bit. So they don't necessarily have access to all ports on, say, your, VPC or virtual private cloud that they're sitting in, or even, IPs. So that security group is something you can even more tune down on the network level for your serverless architectures.
Yeah, that is a very good point. And kind of drilling into that a little bit more, I mean I think by default when you create a Lambda, it's not placed in a VPC at all, but you can allow it to run within the subnets of a VPC, which would allow you to utilize security groups in that way.
Right, and maybe I took an opinionated view very quickly off of that, because a lot of times our architecture, we always keep our Lambdas inside of a VPC, but you don't have to do that. That allows you to kind of, when you can deploy them into a VPC, you can, I think, have that finer grained network control over how they connect to other services in your environment. But right, they don't have to live there. They can live outside of the VPC, and I think that's a more default configuration and easier to get started with, and easier to have access to the internet. When a Lambda is deployed inside of a VPC, there's a little more configuration you have to do to give it access to the internet, plus the services inside of your VPC. So I would say outside of a VPC starting, that's default. Then getting more secure and more fine-grained, you can set that stuff inside of your VPC.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would agree with that too, is that you definitely want that fine-grained control, and placing things into a VPC by, like, even though it's not the quote-unquote default, like it really should be a priority, just to ensure the safety of your or the security of your applications. And yeah, I would like to also I'd like to hear both of you guys, an example from both of you guys for this next question. But if you could, just share an example of a data exposure incident or potential exposure incident in the past in a serverless application, and how it could be prevented. I guess I'll share a little story myself first, but I had been working with a client previously that had just begun their journey into AWS, and were looking into expanding their footprint, and wanted to nail down best practices and make sure that they were following them to ensure the security of their application. So we ended up doing an audit, just looking at a whole bunch of different factors. One of these was looking at S3 as well, the Amazon's simple storage solution, which allows you to place files in virtual buckets, not on a server, right? So a lot of the buckets that we found were completely open to the public, like not actually, they didn't have a policy set at all. So anybody could just pull whatever they wanted. So luckily there was no incident in that case, and there wasn't any PHI data or anything like that. It was mostly just like dummy test data. But that's just one of the things that like a potential thing to keep in mind. Like when working with these different cloud services, the configuration and the steps you need to take to ensure the safety and security are a little bit different, right? So yeah, I was just curious on both of your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. That was something I was going to bring up too, is open, cloud storage to the public is a no-no. Most of the time. I think there are scenarios where you want the public to be able to access something, but you definitely need to set up the proper controls in that flow. There's other things you can do in AWS to provide public access to your bucket. Things like using a Cloudfront distribution to put in front of that. Cloudfront is basically like a caching system that can cache files from S3. It's something you can put a web application firewall in front of too. So it's something you can filter traffic by, and kind of also avoid common attacks such as denial of service attacks and stuff like that. So CloudFront in front of an S3 bucket is kind of a solution to mitigate that kind of problem, but also allow having a public bucket. And
allowing you to have a cert and a custom endpoint too.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's just the more professional way to do it and secure way to do it. So that's kind of, saying what's the solution to your problem, but I guess in terms of an example that I've run into, I've seen definitely several things. When you have obviously unauthenticated APIs are also a problem too. When you're serving up, anything that's unauthenticated and public is going to be a vulnerability, unless you're taking the proper precautions to make it public securely, or you need to restrict access to certain people. So or certain users. So, unauthenticated API gateways in AWS is a problem. As well as just, Tom brought it up earlier about the IAM policies on serverless architectures. When you're allowing when you're allowing a service, let's take a Lambda, for example, and you're connecting to a Dynamo table, when you're allowing the Lambda to say connect to all Dynamo tables that are in your environment versus allowing to connect to just one specific table, granularly defining those resources by name or ID to say, okay, you can only access this specific resource table, not all Dynamo tables. So making sure that those IAM permissions aren't, star permission or access all. You specifically define the resources you want to use.
Yeah. And just to note, like it is a lot easier now. Like if you think like, oh, the granular permissions, like a lot of the frameworks make it very easy to do, and just kind of can do it automatically for you. But yeah, so my experience, I haven't had too much with like an open bucket or like a data storage, but just trying to think about it, the issues that we always kind of had, and we're trying to figure out the best way to deal with data in the serverless sense, was with logs, and getting like sensitive information in logs, and we sometimes use third-party providers, and if sensitive information gets over there, it's an issue. So that's something that we always kind of had to deal with, and there's a constant battle of tightening that up, making it useful for the developers, and getting the information that they need, but also, being secure, being compliant, all the compliance as well, right? Of not having a PII, and then, GDPR, having to be able to delete the information. These aren't necessarily serverless things, but these are the problems that, I did face when dealing with serverless, that mostly were prevalent with data and logs, sensitive data.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think both you guys touched on some really important things that which I would consider as best practices just to be able to use for in any environment. How we would implement the principle of least privilege. Locking things down, opening up IAM roles, for example, just allowing your function to only access the certain specific resources and perform certain specific actions. We talked about logging and monitoring, and making sure that those are handled securely, like you're saying, making sure there's no PHI in logs or even errors, like error messages. But yeah, I'd like to dig in a little bit more of some other like best practices that you guys would recommend for just in general, like what about like handling secrets, right? Like credentials and things like that. You'll have Lambda functions, right, that will need to access potentially other APIs or other systems. Like, what are some good ways to be able to deal with that securely?
Sure. I gotta just point out right away, AWS Secrets Manager. Again, focusing on AWS here. It's the place where you can store credentials where they're encrypted, either by a default encryption key, or you can have a new encryption key where you encrypt your secret. But the Secrets Manager is another service where you can store those credentials. No matter what they are, you basically store plain text or JSON schema, and it encrypts it. And then your services, like say Lambda, you can give your Lambda permission to read a specific secret. So again, you don't have to give it permission to all secrets. You can restrict it down to that one, secret that holds maybe your API credentials. And your Lambda then can pull that secret and use the credentials to call the API or whatever authenticated service it needs to. So certainly that's the place to store credentials. You don't want to be putting them in plain text locations like environment variables. On a Lambda might be one, gotcha. Environment variables are an easy place to store some data that a Lambda can use. Another place that is not so bad is a AWS Systems Manager, where you can store parameters. You can store encrypted parameters there. So that is a place where you could store a credential and have it encrypted, which would be okay. I wouldn't say it's as good as the Secrets Manager, but that has encryption capabilities. So SSM, Systems Manager parameters, is a place too.
Yeah. And just to go off of that, a lot of the providers make it very easy. What gets hard sometimes when dealing with serverless and you have, cold starts and things like that, it can be easy to kind of architect it where you're always getting that secret, right, to access that database. So in these ephemeral environments like Lambda, other serverless things, you kind of have to think about caching more, right, and the performance. Yeah, so just kind of like some tidbits on it. What's really nice, I'm excited for it, and hopefully it comes out for the JavaScript runtime, but the snapshots, right, being able to that AWS Lambda has, being able to get those secrets, store them in memory, and then being able to take that snapshot of that Lambda function, so that you don't have to get it, and then also, from there, not just the cold start, but also every time it's called, right? Maybe just refreshing it every 5 minutes, pulling that secret, so you're not doing it every single time. Yeah, just something to think about, right? It's a little different in the serverless environment. It can be really easy to, call all the things all the time, but then you had to get burned on the performance, right, when doing that with those federal environments.
And the cost too.
Yeah.
Every API call the Secrets Manager is going to be a cost. So,
yep.
Great point.
Yeah, excellent. I also, you had reminded me of another thing that I wanted to bring up too, is just to start a discussion about the potential use of Lambda layers as like from a security standpoint. I like Lambda layers a lot, especially for using potential libraries, like third-party libraries that aren't part of like your standard Python library, or Java, or whatever flavor of Lambda that you're using. But I do like the ability to be able to isolate and then update depending on if there is a security vulnerability found for that library. And I wanted to hear what you guys had to say as well. One thing that I'm not actually quite sure about is, like, are the layers themselves encrypted? Like, could you use something like the key management service to encrypt those? Like, I don't know if that's possible. But yeah, I was curious of what you guys had to say about that topic.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure if the Lambda layers themselves are encrypted. But I mean, to your point, I like putting my third-party libraries in a Lambda layer, um, just because it encapsulates those libraries away. I mean, usually 99.9% of the time, you're not going to want to modify third-party libraries unless you have a very extreme reason to. So you just going to want to put those somewhere and not worry about them. Well, worry about them in terms of if they have vulnerabilities and need to update them. But in terms of Lambda, I like to be able to see my code. Lambda allows you to, view a certain size of code if you're using Python or Node or another interpreted language. And so having that ability to see that code in the console in your browsers is really useful for debugging and troubleshooting. And then you just kind of have these dependencies that are built in a layer. You can't see them really, they're linked there. And they're there, but it's more about your code that you've written to see that there. So being able to have a freight, so kind of, looking holistically at the scope of a project that you deploy to a cloud environment, it's really helpful to have a tool that can, package your dependencies into a layer and deploy that layer and have that linked to your Lambda and your actual application code that you've written. It's helpful to have a framework that does that. Something like serverless framework, for example, is one I'm very familiar with that can separate those pieces. And so in terms of, scanning for vulnerabilities, that's important to do. And AWS has tools. They have something called AWS Inspector, which will, run scans on your layers, your Lambda code, and it can give you the feedback on vulnerabilities with those third-party libraries or not. That's something integrated into AWS. It's a service. There's obviously other services, third-party services that can do vulnerability scanning, but that's very helpful to have in AWS, and to confirm if, hey, you have critical high vulnerabilities in your layer, your third-party dependencies that you need to remediate and update those libraries. So you don't have vulnerabilities in your code. And that's something that in AWS that scans consistently or concurrently over time. So it's something you can always check in on. I know that was a lot about vulnerabilities, but that's and kind of how a project goes together. But those third-party libraries, you never know if there's a dependency, or not dependency, but you never know if there's a vulnerability with them unless you have something scanning them. So that is something that can be done inside of the layer.
Yeah, absolutely. All great points. I do want to note that we are kind of coming up on time here. I wanted to leave a little bit of room just to allow both you guys to just have final thoughts on security in general. I mean, like I said, huge topic. We only really just scratched the surface, but I guess in general, Tom, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we wrap up?
It's nice that AWS takes more of that responsibility, but it does give you more time, more of a budget, right, to kind of focus on your application and your pipeline. Well, we didn't even go into that, but that's becomes a big factor as well when talking about security, that you kind of have to focus on still with serverless, and utilize tools that are out there. There's a lot of nice ones, right? That'll, the static code analysis, right? Looking for vulnerabilities in the packages that you have. A lot of generous free tiers out there. So yeah, definitely leverage those tools in your pipeline to, constantly be scanning your application and configuration that you have.
Right. Yes, all great points. And Preston, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Tom said is completely true. CI/CD is a way to standardize your deployments, make sure everything's consistent every time. I think just consistency is the path to having a stable and secure environment. Make sure everything is deployed the same way every time. It's not like you're managing a server and you can go in and just like change some configurations and it's good. When you're in a cloud environment, you usually have many services to configure, and it's impossible to do that manually. It all has to be scripted, and it all has to be thought through on let's only give these things the limited number of permissions that they need. That's the best way to go, and definitely there's a lot, especially each service it's going to have different security considerations, and I think constant remediation is a key to that. CI/CD and constant remediation, keeping your environment up to date. Just practice that and you'll go a long way.
Yep, it's a constant battle. Yep. Great points. All right. We are a little over time here, but Tom, Preston, as always, thank you both. It was great hearing from you and engaging in some great discussion with you guys. I also want to thank all the listeners for tuning in to this episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders, and we hope you found the conversation valuable and informative. And we'd love to have you join us again for the next episode. And in this next one, Ray Welker will be kicking off a new series called Infrastructure as Code, kind of similar to this series that I've been hosting on Serverless. But he'll be focusing on Infrastructure as Code. So as always, episode will feature expert guests and interactive conversations, so be sure to tune in.
Thank you.
Thank Jason.
Thanks, everybody.